All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to our webinar. Oh, I didn't start it. How do I? Oh, there it is.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar. In the next 30 minutes, we will talk about expensing travel and requesting reimbursement in the Concur system. Now, if you are joining us on the webinar side of things, you should have a panel. It's probably on the right-hand side of your screen. And hopefully you see a section that says questions. And please use that section to submit any questions our way, and we will get to those as they appear. So let's go ahead and jump right into the webinar. So what we will talk about today is what is Concur, what are the benefits of Concur, what is a travel card and why might I want one, and then we'll get into a demo for expensing travel and requesting reimbursement. So Concur is what's known as a SaaS, which is a software as a service, and what that means is that we can access Concur from anywhere and anytime. As long as we have access to a website or the internet, we can get access to Concur. On the right side of your screen, there are quite a few peer institutions that have already gone to Concur. One that might capture your interest is kind of in the middle of that collage there, the CU logo, so our neighbors just up the street there. They've been in Concur for about 10 years, and so we're really looking forward to joining them as far as expensing travel and requesting travel using the Concur system. But for us, Concur is more than travel. We will definitely use it to request travel and to book travel online, and of course to expense our travel once we get back from our trip. But we'll also use it to reconcile our P-card transactions and to request reimbursements for local travel and non-travel related purchases. In the travel world, Concur gives us several options. So on the left side of your screen, Concur definitely supports a fully coordinated model where the AA, travel coordinator, travel arranger, they go by several names, where the travel coordinator and the traveler where the traveler is fully supported by the travel coordinator, and the travel coordinator does most of the travel arrangements. So that is one option in Concur. Another option is on the far right-hand side of your screen, what we're referring to as self-managed travel. So this is a scenario where the traveler takes a very active role in his or her travel. They book their own travel, request their own travel, even expense their own travel once they get back from a trip, and Concur definitely supports that model. But Concur also supports a hybrid approach, and that's really what the middle of this diagram represents. So Concur would support a model where the travel coordinator and traveler work hand in hand as far as requesting, booking, and expensing travel. So for example, this might mean that the travel coordinator requests the trip, the traveler books the trip and even does some of the expensing piece, and then the travel coordinator helps on the expensing side as far as getting that expense report all complete. So there's definitely options available. If you're interested in learning more about this and brainstorming on ways to have Concur work for you, please email concur@ucar.edu and we'd be happy to brainstorm with you. Some of the benefits of Concur is, first of all, just the fact that we could get to it anywhere at any time. Just by having access to the internet will allow us access to Concur. Concur has business rules and tooltips that guide us, and we'll definitely see this on the expense report side of things. We'll see messages pop up that give us guidance as far as what needs to be entered and making sure that things are appropriate. It gives us enhanced reporting and expense reporting capabilities and definitely improves our approval tracking. But ultimately, the biggest benefits of Concur is faster reimbursements and, of course, saving time and money, which is the ultimate goal. There is a travel card available. We are calling this the T card for short. And so this is what's referred to as a corporate liability card, which means that anytime you use the travel card for your travel expenses, UCAR is paying for that expense directly. Because of that, we know that this will reduce cash advances and also reduce out-of-pocket reimbursements, because hopefully most of your trip expenses will go on that travel card. It's definitely recommended for all travelers. So if you're interested, we have a guide on how to get the travel card on the what's referred to as the Concur user support site, and I'll get there here in just a second. Okay. Oh, alrighty. So as far as travel is concerned, there's really 4 steps to travel. First one is to make a travel request, and that's done in Concur. The second one is to book the trip, either online through Concur, by phone with Kane, or even going outside of either of those. And then, of course, the travel needs to happen, and hopefully those travel expenses are being charged to the UCAR travel card. But where we are focusing on today's webinar is step 4, which is to submit your expense report through Concur. We've already covered some of those other steps in a previous webinar. So let's go ahead and get into Concur and see what expensing looks like. All right, so here I am in Concur. I do want to first say that if you are a travel coordinator acting on behalf of somebody, you'll want to do all of the steps that I demo here. The only difference is that you will first use your profile, and you'll see a box that says who you are acting on behalf of. And so that's the only difference in regards to acting on behalf of somebody as a travel coordinator. Okay, now let's see how to expense a trip in Concur. Now, in our previous webinar, we already did our travel request, and we used Concur to book our trip. So we are actually going to begin with that travel request. There are a couple ways to find that request, but I like to go to my request tab along the top. And then here in my list, here's our trip, Kansas City. And then all the way on the right-hand side, I have an expense link. So I'm going to click that to start the expense report. Now my expense report header fills in for me already based on my travel request. So at this point, I want to review my header and make sure that it accurately reflects what happened on the trip. For example, my trip dates might have changed, so I'd want to make sure that my header reflects those actual trip dates. If my destination changed, if there ended up being personal days or not personal days, I'd want to make sure that that's all reflected here. If I do make any changes to the header, I'll want to be sure to add a comment to my approver. And yes, this helps my approver know what happened, but ultimately it helps for audit purposes. If this expense report happens to get pulled in a year, 2 years, 3 years, this will help us know what really happened on this trip. So if I make any changes to this header, I want to make sure to add a comment to my approver to document why my trip changed from what the request indicated. Okay. For my trip, my header looks good. There were no unforeseen circumstances. So I'm going to click Next in the lower right corner of my window. And then I'll be greeted with a question asking if there is per diem as part of this trip. And in my case, there is. So I'll say yes. Now, in order to calculate per diem, we are going to start with an itinerary. And I like to refer to this as a per diem itinerary because that's really what the heart of it is to calculate per diem. Now, if I booked my trip through Concur or through a travel agent at Kane, I will have an itinerary ready to import. So I'm going to click this Import Itinerary button, select my trip, and import it into this per diem itinerary. Now, if I didn't use Kane or use Concur, that's okay. It just means that I would need to use this right-hand pane to manually enter all of my trip stops. And a trip stop is basically just where there was an overnight stay. So I could see on the left-hand side of this area, my trip stops. It documents when I went to Kansas City and then when I left Kansas City and came back home. Now, this is based off of the airfare that I booked in Concur. So if my overnight happened to be somewhere other than Kansas City, for example, maybe I landed in Kansas City but then had to drive a couple hours to get to the place where I actually spent the night, all I would do is select that line and then make the appropriate changes on the right-hand side of my screen and save it. Okay. But for this particular trip, that left-hand side looks good to me, so I'm going to click the Next button in the lower right corner of my window. Concur automatically assigns my per diem itinerary to this expense report, so I'm just going to click Next again. I don't need to do anything on the second screen. And then here's where I see the check boxes for what meals were provided throughout the trip. Now, for example, my hotel provided breakfast for me each day, so I would check these check boxes to decrease the amount of the reimbursement by breakfast. There was lunch provided one day, dinner provided another. So this right-hand side reflects all of those per diem amounts that I am allowed for each day of the trip. If there was any PTO or personal travel days associated, that's when I would use this exclude checkbox on the left side. So that way I could exclude any days fully from the per diem. Okay. Once I have my checkboxes accurately reflect what meals provided, then I'll click the Create Expenses button in the lower right corner of the screen. And that's what will add my per diem meals to my expense report. Okay. So now I want to add the other trip expenses to this expense report. And there's a couple different ways that I could do that. First of all, if I used my travel card, or if I used this app that I highly recommend called Expensit, those expenses will show up in this Import Expenses area. Now, the Expensit app is great for receipts. It's a fabulous app to take pictures of our receipts, and then they actually do some of the analyzing for us. So I highly recommend using it, but they would also show in this Import Expenses area. This is what the Import Expenses area looks like. It's on the right-hand side of my screen. And I have some of my P-card transactions and some of my travel card transactions listed here. So I'm going to use this drop-down so that I only see my travel card transactions. And then I'll select the card transactions that actually happened during this trip. And in this case, it was all of them. So I'll click this top checkbox and then the Move button. Okay. If you see this matching message, I say just go ahead and hit continue. This is just Concur's way of helping to marry any card transactions with Expensit receipt pictures taken. And so that's a highly helpful thing that it's doing. Okay. Now along the top of my page, I have exceptions. And exceptions are one of the ways that Concur helps guides us. Whenever I see a red circle with an exclamation mark in it, that's what I think of as a stop sign. It's a red exception. It means that I have to fix something before I can actually submit this expense report. Sometimes you might see these yellow exceptions, the yellow triangles. These are things that are highlighted within my expense report, but they will not go away because they are going to be highlighted for everybody in the expense report process, for my approvers, for the travel office, so that everybody knows that these transactions were highlighted and the reason that they were highlighted. Okay, so ultimately what I want to do is I want to get rid of these red stop signs, and I do that by fully adding these expenses. Now the first one that I see here is it's noted as rental car, but the vendor, it says office warehouse. So I'm going to go ahead and select that one. Okay. Now the first thing that you want to do as you are looking at a transaction is you want to review that expense type. In this particular case, this expense type is not accurate. This was not my rental car purchase. It was actually a restaurant that was called Office Warehouse. And so this is a case where I have my meal, my per diem meal at a restaurant that I paid for on the travel card. That's okay. That's perfectly fine, but what I need to do in that case is I need to mark this meal using the expense type of actual meal cost personal expense. What that will do is it will decrease my per diem reimbursement by the cost of this meal. So once I select that expense type, everything else looks good. I just save in the lower right-hand corner, and that expense is taken care of. Okay. Now I can see here for Cafe Monte, that's another per diem meal that I paid for on my travel card. So that one actually did come through using the correct expense type. So I don't need to do anything to that one. I could just go ahead and move on. I'm going to skip lodging for a second and go to this undefined. Now I'm going to click it, and there ends up being a receipt to it. So let me pull that up. Oh, Enterprise, this is my rental car. So here's another case where my expense type didn't come through correctly, but that's okay. It's an easy fix. I'm going to go back to my expense tab, use this expense type drop down to find rental car, and I could start to type, and that filters my list a little bit. Okay, that came in great. City of purchase was Kansas City. I could just select it from my list there. Everything else looks great. Now when I save it, that card transaction is all taken care of, and I've also gotten rid of that red stop sign, so that's awesome. That's a quick fix. Okay, next, let's take this lodging transaction. Now, lodging actually can need a little bit of work because we must itemize our lodging expenses. And this actually has been itemized a little bit for me. And the way it was itemized a little bit for me is because I use the Expense It app to take a picture of my receipt. So it's already done some of the work for me. And I could tell that by this little chevron or arrow. That's a signal that this has been itemized. When I click this chevron or arrow, I can then see all of the itemizations underneath it. And as you can tell, we need to break this lodging transaction out or itemize it by each day. So the lodging rate for each day or night, the lodging tax, and then any of these other charges that are there. Okay, so again, this was done for me already a little bit because of that Expense It app, but now I need to finish taking care of all of these red stop signs. So to do that, I'll just select one of these lines. Okay, and in this case, this was an extra tax. It was a resort fee that was charged. So I'll use that expense type to select the lodging fees. Again, as I start to type, it narrows down my list of expense types. So lodging fees. Okay, that all looks good. When I save it, that stop sign is going to go away for that line. So I've already taken care of that one itemization. Now let me give you a little tip. Sometimes you might have itemizations that are all for the same thing. So for example, this $9.95 charge, let's say that that was internet. So what I can do is I can select that checkbox over there on the left and do the same thing for any others of those internet charges. Let's say that this was also one. So now I can edit that drop down, that expense type at the same time for these. So I'll say that I want to edit. I want the expense type to be internet. Okay, and now there is another list for internet so that I could truly say what type of telecommunication this is. Now when I save, I've taken care of both of those itemizations at the same time. Okay, let me show you again. Let's say that the rest of these were all my room service, just various room service, restaurant charges, and I am going to note that for all of these at the same time. So I'm just checking those. Of course, I've looked at my receipt at my folio to make sure that's what they are, but they are indeed. So I'll click this edit link. For expense type, I'll use that personal actual meal cost personal expense type. Save it. It's taken a little bit because it's got several itemizations to work through, but there it goes. And now all of those itemizations have been taken care of, and they've been accurately expensed based on what happened for that trip. This expense is actually completely taken care of because my receipt has also been attached. That's because I used the Expense It app. One way that I could see that receipt is by hovering my mouse over that little blue circle with the piece of paper in it. There's my receipt, so that's how I can make sure that everything I selected is indeed accurate for that itemization. Now that that lodging is itemized, I'm going to click that little chevron or arrow to hide those itemizations and get a little bit more real estate on that page. Okay. There might be some out-of-pocket expenses. So we've talked about how to add those travel card expenses and even those expenses where we've used the Expense It app. Again, highly suggested. But what happens if you paid for something out of pocket, so you paid for it personally? One of the very common things that we pay for personally is mileage, right? We use our personal car for our mileage to and from the airport. So I'm going to select the personal car mileage expense type. Okay. Now for mileage, we have a mileage calculator to help us calculate how much mileage we drove. Oh, and I see a question here.
If a hotel is paid on a T-card, do travelers still take a photo via Expense It for itemizing?
Ah,
Uh,
great
Great.
question. Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.
Yes,
Yes,
you want to
you
use
want
the
to use the
Expensive
Expense
app
It app
for
for
any
any
of your
of your
receipts,
receipts,
no
no
matter if it
matter
was
if it
paid
was
for the
paid for the
travel
travel
card
card
or with your
or with your
personal
personal
funds.
funds.
So I
So I
highly
highly
recommend Expensive for
recommend
all
for
of your
all of your
expenses.
expenses.
All righty. So now that we're doing our mileage, we're going to use this mileage calculator. And so we'll begin by entering our waypoint where we began. So let's say in this case that I began at my office. So as I start to type, if I've entered it before, it'll come up automatically. And then I drove to DIA. So I'm going to, in that second line there, start to type Denver International. And once I get about that far, I'll just click outside of that box and it'll fill in Denver International Airport for me. Now it went ahead and it calculated out some of my possible routes, but I could also drag this blue line and customize my route. And that might be helpful if there was a really big detour, maybe there was an accident or some big construction happening, and I really needed to calculate that because it really added some time and distance to my mileage. So there we go. I have where I started, where I ended, and I have two options. I could add two separate mileage expenses, one for going to the airport and another one when I came back, but I'm actually going to click this Make Round Trip link so that I could just do that all in one expense. Okay. Now I'm going to add my mileage to my expense report. There it is. I'll say the date because this is capturing both of them. I'm going to select the end date of my trip. Everything looks great. So now when I save, that will add my expense to the left-hand side. So that's how you go ahead and add your out-of-pocket or personally paid expenses. Okay. Now one other type of expense that you'll want to add is things that are paid for by UCAR directly but not put on your travel card. So one common example is airfare. This also might happen with your rental car charges. So in that case, here I have my airfare already. So I could just select it from my list. Everything looks great. Oh, in this case, my receipt is already attached because I went ahead and used Expense It for that. Fabulous. There was nothing I needed to do to that one, so I could just go ahead and save. Very commonly, you will need to use Expense It for your airfare receipts, and oftentimes that is the itinerary that's emailed to you from the travel agency. So that might be Kane, or if you go outside, we do need to have that receipt even if it's directly paid for by UCAR. Another very common one is rental car. This one actually happened to be charged to my travel card, but if rental car were paid for directly by UCAR in a direct bill situation, you'd want to be sure to add that to your expense report so that we get the full effect of how much this trip was. Okay, oh, there's another question. Let's see what this one has.
What if someone uses a T-card to pay for their own flight and a spouse's flight when traveling on UCAR business?
All right, so if the T-card is used to pay for your own flight for business reasons, but then you also included your spouse's flight on there, you would want to mark your spouse's flight as a personal expense. The reason you want to do that is because you did use your travel card, so we do need to include that as part of this expense report. And marking it as a personal expense decreases whatever reimbursement is due to you by that amount. Now, because we're dealing with airfare, that could be a hefty expense. So it's possible in that case that you might have actually paid more, or I should say that UCAR paid more for your spouse's ticket than what your reimbursement was going to be. So in that case, you might actually need to reimburse UCAR the difference. And that would just be writing UCAR a personal check. If that did happen, there would be an exception that appeared up top in this area here that would say that a little bit is owed to UCAR and give you some guidance on that. Alrighty, so now we've gone through several things. We've created our expense report. We've added our expenses to this expense report. Something else that we'll need to do is receipts. Now, when I use my Expenses app, that takes care of the receipts for me. So that is awesome because I've already done that step for a lot of these purchases. If I didn't use the Expenses app, another option is to scan those receipts and just attach them. Travel coordinators, this is what you'll be doing mostly, is scanning those receipts and attaching them. So in order to attach a receipt, let's say that I needed to attach a receipt here. I don't, but let's say that I did in this case. Then what I would do is I would select the expense from the left-hand side, click the Attach Receipt button in the lower right corner of my screen, and then it's very similar to attaching to an email. I'll browse for where that receipt is. It's within my pictures. And these penguins are an awesome receipt. So I'll just go ahead and attach that. Okay, and so now I have this tab of the receipt image. And of course, I always recommend looking at that just to make sure that everything is legible and that it's indeed the receipt that I expected to attach. Okay. Another thing that you might need to do is you might need to allocate this expense. So allocating in Concur is how we say what account keys need to be charged. Now our account key is actually entered all the way on the header. So if we're using the same account key for the entire trip, we're good to go. But if I needed to change the account key or split the account keys, that's where the allocation comes in. So let's say that I needed to charge this rental car to a different account key. I have my rental car expense selected, and then in the lower right corner, I'll click the Allocate button. And then once that Allocate window comes up, there it is. This is where I would say what should be charged for this rental car. Now I could allocate by either percentage or amount, so either of those is super helpful if I'm splitting. So let's say this one in particular needs to be split between two account keys. So right now 50% is going to this one account key, and then I could have 50% going to a completely different account key. Okay, then when it's all good, I'll just save it. And that's how you can allocate or change account keys for individual expenses. Okay. So that's pretty much it for the entire expense report process. We've talked about how to create the expense report, how to add our expenses, how to add our receipts, and how to allocate. The very final step is to submit it. Now, travel coordinators, if you're doing this on behalf of somebody, you cannot submit the expense report for them. Only your travelers can actually submit the expense report. So to submit the expense report, we'll click the Submit Report button in the upper right corner of your screen. And then this is why only the traveler can submit the report. It's because the traveler is certifying that this is a true and accurate accounting of the trip. And so the traveler is really the only one in the position to truly certify that. So I highly recommend looking at that agreement, click Accept and Submit, and then that's what will move it on down to my approvers. So who approves expense reports? Well, it's a little different from the travel request. On the travel request, we had two levels of approval, the supervisor and then the budget approver. On expense reports, it is only one level, and it is the budget approver. So the supervisor does not need to approve expense reports. Once the budget approver approves the expense report, then it will go to the travel office so that they could do their review and then go ahead and send it on down the reimbursement path. Alrighty. Well, thank you all so much for joining us in today's webinar. This was recorded, so this will be posted on the Concur user support site. Now, that being said, what's an easy way to get to the Concur user support site? Well, when you're in Concur, if you use the help in the upper right-hand corner and select training, that will take you directly to that Concur user support site. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Muted.